environment.
You're listening to Why We Do What We Do.
Hello and welcome to Why We Do What We Do. This is your host, Abraham.
And your co-host, RYANO.
And so today we're going to be tackling, this is a dense topic.
Very.
And we're going to have to sort of scratch the surface like we do with many things. And so we're going to make things maybe seem a little bit more simple than they really are at times. And I guess I'm just teasing a whole lot, not actually talking. I haven't said what we've been talking about today. Although if you're listening to this, you probably saw the title. So we're talking about genetics, and it's more complicated than that because we're actually talking about genes and how they relate to behavior, which is related to behavioral genetics. We're also talking about epigenetics and basically trying to examine the way that genes influence our behavior and sort of vice versa,
right?
Yeah, exactly.
Nice.
So let's. I would actually like to start by just revisiting this definition of behavior. Okay.
Yeah.
So remember that from like one of our first episodes we ever did?
Yeah. So our second episode, we did what is psychology, and we kind of talked about what is behavior, what is included in it, the mind, the brain, the various different. What other entities are there?
Well, the environment, past experiences, current circumstances.
Yeah, I was trying to get the.
Oh, like the biological components.
Yeah, like what other entities?
I remember mentioning the liver just to give an example of an organ. I could have said lungs or intestines or whatever, but
yeah, and we basically came around to that it is the whole person, right?
Yeah,
that is behaving.
Right. So
it's all those things coming together.
Yeah, behavior is the whole interaction. So it's all the whole biological organism is composed of all these pieces, and that the entire interaction of the biological the person basically or the animal in their circumstances, all that back and forth. That's what we're calling behavior, basically. Okay.
Yeah.
So and the reason that we're talking about this again is because this comes back to placing a really strong emphasis when we're trying to understand behavior, both conceptually and scientifically, of looking at behavior as it with respect to the whole organism, not just the brain, and not just another body part, like the body part that's performing an action, but the sum of its parts, I guess.
Yeah. So keep that in the back of your mind as we're kind of going through this stuff, right?
Yeah.
Okay. So let's jump into genes. Let's just go straight into it and describe what they are.
Right. So probably you've heard something along the lines of someone has good genes, or to what extent is their behavior genetic, and what that. So let's unpack what that means. Like, what is a gene? Where is a gene? What role does it play? What does it actually do? And so I'm going to start a little bit big, and by big I mean extremely small. But I'm going to start a little bit big, and then shrink down all the way to the gene portion of this. Okay. All right, so the very first part is, it could be larger than this, but what I'm going to start is called a gamete. And this is just a reproductive cell, and you probably know them as a sperm or a spermatozoa. And another reproductive cell is the ovum or the egg. And so these, like I said, these are cells. They're the reproductive cells. And so that's the largest piece I'm going to start with, okay?
Okay, so next part is the cell, right?
Yeah, so inside the cell, basically.
Yeah, so inside the cell is the nucleus.
Right.
That is essentially kind of, it's oftentimes pointed out as like the most important part, but again, it's not.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It's a part, and it plays an important role.
Yeah.
And so, all right, so you have your gamete, which is your reproductive cell. Inside this reproductive cell, you got your nucleus. Then inside your nucleus, you have these clusters of chromosomes. Your reproductive cell is going to have about 23 of them. And then inside, what the chromosomes are comprised of these sequences of strings. And these are
your base pairs, right?
Yeah, DNA base pairs, and particular segments of those DNA base pairs are genes. Okay?
Okay.
So basically you have your DNA, it's in these long coils that make up a chromosome, and segments of those coils are called genes. And they specifically what they do is they code for the production of proteins. So just to go down a little bit further.
Yeah.
So we have those genes. So the chromosomes and the genes, again, they're made up of these the whole name is deoxyribonucleic acid, which is DNA. And though that's one of those. I mean, you can keep going smaller, but that's for our purposes where we want to go. Someone you have good DNA, or it's in your DNA. that whole idea. So with DNA, we're talking about those base pairs, Okay, so it's sort of like, I was equating this to a Russian nesting doll.
Yeah.
It's like you open it up and it's a little bit smaller, open up like a little bit smaller. But in this case, they're pretty different structures.
They're very, very small too.
Yeah, very much smaller than a Russian nesting. Anyway, so genes, these segments of DNA, or I guess the DNA that makes up these segments that exist in a chromosome, what they do, these genes are responsible for they code for the production of certain proteins in certain sequences. That's the most general statement, is just that they will either cause a protein to occur or they will inhibit a protein. They cause them to occur in these particular sequences. So what's really crucial in understanding these is whether or not a particular gene is present and to what extent it is expressed. And on top of that is how other genes are also expressed will affect how that one is expressed. Okay? So it's sort of like thinking about if you have two colors, when you mix them, then they change what they look like. So, and that's a similar way, I mean, a very simplistic, reductionist way of looking at.
Yeah. So this exponentially gets very complex immediately.
Yeah, right? And there's so much to know about that. And I think just the simplest way of looking at it is that genes are these segments of our biology, very small. And what they do is they code for the production of proteins in particular sequences. And those genes and their expression interact with each other. And so the entire genetic makeup of a person is referred to as their genotype. Okay, so you might look, if you were to code someone's entire genetic sequence that they described as their genotype, that's what their genes consist of, what's present in their body.
So if we bring this back into like behavior and like our genes and genetics, like what do they code for? Like how much of a role do they play in like what I do, like why we do what we do every day, right?
Right.
It reminds me of a resource I really came fond of, and there's a guy, N.H. Pronko, and what he talked about was he liked to take things like this, like nature versus nurture, or like genes and behavior, like what role do these kind of separate and play? And I think it's important to bring up that if you're kind of separating things like that, right? And I guess we're taught a lot through our culture of like these things play a certain role. They play a role in the context of everything else, right?
Yep.
And if you put emphasis on one or the other, or kind of in these dichotomies, sort of like two things, like genes and behavior, he basically says you're already kind of running into a problem there because you're not focusing on everything that could potentially be playing a part, right?
Okay.
I guess we get to a little bit later, but the environment plays a heavy role in how all this happens, right?
Yeah. Oh, yeah. I mean, it's just part of the whole interaction expression of what the biological organism, what it's going to do, like how it's going to turn out, what it's capable of. All of those things they're inherently part of the same process. And trying to separate them becomes not only really difficult, but kind of pointless because they're always influencing one another. That being said, there are reasons to look at these things separately, and we'll get to those in a moment.
Yes, and I would say like it's very important to understand it at these different levels, these psychological levels, the biological levels, the chemical levels, etc. But it's them all coming together in this kind of integrated whole event that is very important to never lose sight of.
Right. Yeah. So I guess I should walk back and say it's not pointless, except from the standpoint of just conceptually understanding how behavior works. That distinction is not all that important, and so it really depends, as you really just pointed out, on the sort of the level of analysis that you're making. Right.
Okay. Cool. Okay. Yeah. Level analysis. I like that. Maybe the listeners enjoy that too.
Okay.
Level analysis. Let's refer to that. Cool.
New buzzword for the episode.
Yeah.
Okay, so there's a couple of really good metaphors that I like that I want to tie into helping describe or just give a relatable example to an extent of how genes and our environment sort of interact with each other, and to bring home this idea of how they're part of the same process. And the first one, there was this article published in maybe the 90s, I can't even remember, but it's called Lessons from the Pillsbury Doughboy, and it's specifically with respect to the interaction of genes, understanding like what genes sort of contribute to behavior and understanding behavior. It's a little bit simplistic, but I really like the idea in it. And how it works is it's this idea that if you're making bread, you have wheat or flour of some kind. You have your flour and your sugar and your water and your yeast and maybe eggs or something. But those are sort of, you have these main ingredients. Okay, in this metaphor, all those ingredients, the flour and the water and the sugar and the yeast, those are the genes. And what you can take is the same amount and the same exact type of flour, sugar, water, yeast, and put it in all these different bowls. And one of these bowls, we're going to mix it up really, really good, and we're going to let it sit and we're going to let it rise.
Mm-hmm.
And the other bowl, we're going to mix it up really, really good, but then we're going to immediately put it on the stove and we're going to start cooking it. And one of these bowls, we're going to mix up, let it really good, and we're going to let it rise. And these two that we're going to let rise, one of them we're going to bake, one of them we're going to fry. We're going to add other things to them. And so the point of this whole metaphor was, if you look at each one of these bowls, they all have the exact same ingredients, which is to say, in this metaphor, the exact same genes. But depending on how you cooked them, like if you fried them or baked them or roasted them on the skillet or whatever,
how they're expressed, right?
Yeah, they're gonna be completely different. You get something that's like pancakes, or something that's like a loaf of bread, or something that's like a sourdough.
Scones, yeah,
just magically get scones. So all of these are it just basically speaking to that how it's prepared is extremely important in understanding how it's going to turn out in the end. Even when you have the exact same ingredients in the exact same quantity, and they might even start at the exact same time, if they go through these different types of, in this case, experiences, then they turn out differently.
Yeah.
Okay, so there's this exercise I like to do in my class that it would be really fun to bring in a whole bunch of flour and wheat and sugar and yeast and have my students mess with that and make a mess everywhere. But instead, what I decided to do was bring in paint, and I gave everybody 4 of the exact same color. Okay. But then I gave them different paintbrushes and a different canvas, and I just said, paint something, whatever you want, doesn't matter. And then I wanted to look and say, how many of you made the exact same picture?
Ooh.
Right?
Did anybody make the same picture?
No. No one ever. Not. Yeah. Like you get some like sort of similar themes. People are likely to draw pictures of people. Sometimes they'll draw, a tangible object like a flower. Yeah. Sometimes it's just smeared paint everywhere.
Yeah.
And so, but nobody ever made anything that was even really looked like they were really the same, unless there's common shapes, which you might see. But the point I was getting at was, like, if you look at, again, the ingredients in this case, or the genes, or the colors, but everybody else brought to those colors their own experiences and their own thoughts and their own, and so the way that their picture shaped up depended on 1, the type of canvas that they used, and 2, the type of brush that they used, and then 3, also the amount of each of those paint colors that they used, right? So some of those colors were, even though they started with the exact same thing, some of those colors were expressed a lot, and some of them were not expressed hardly at all. And depending on the color of the canvas, people, if the canvas was white, they didn't use a lot of white. Yeah. But all that's to say that this is just one of those things where even when you have the same exact starting place genetically, those circumstances, like the environment, in this case, like the paintbrush and the canvas, those are all going to affect how that picture shows up, like what you choose to draw, how much space you have to draw. All of those things affect. And so that was sort of my exercise in just trying to give people a metaphor to interact with that was supposed to be sort of a demonstration of how genes interact, and how, although the colors determined what kind of colors they could get, and what kind of pictures they could make, they didn't really affect in any way the overall picture that they would produce for the most part. Yeah. I mean, the brush kind of did, but again, that was one of the circumstances of their environment. It's just sort of like this, what's available is this, so this is how it's likely to turn out.
Okay, so a couple guys making a podcast talking about this sort of stuff and why we do what we do. Maybe have a little bit of validity based on our backgrounds, where we're from, right? Yeah. But what do the experts have to say on this?
So I pulled from 3 sources, and so these aren't actually geneticists, but there are these people who, the first one I had 2 quotes from, and she wrote a really commonly used book on child development. Okay. And so the first thing that she had in her book that I really liked on this was, she says, quote, "Chromosomes and genes do not determine behavior," end quote. Okay.
It's pretty bold.
Yeah, very straightforward. Yeah. She's just laid it out there. And by the way, her name is Berger. Last name is Berger. I think it's Kathleen Berger, but I could be wrong about that. And then the other quote I really liked was, "Nothing is totally genetic, not even such obvious traits as height or hair color, but nothing is untouched by genes."
I really like that. Yeah, I really like that end part, that nothing's untouched by genes.
Exactly right.
It plays a very important role, and it is a role. It is not the role.
Right. And so going back to those same metaphors I used, that you had to have the capacity, the genes had to give you the capacity for these environmental circumstances to be meaningful and interact with you in some way, but they didn't determine how that interaction necessarily would play out. in the specific details, you know.
Mm-hmm.
And in a way, you know, they influenced what kind of biology you could have that you would be prepared to respond or react to those circumstances. But how you respond and react to those circumstances was not just because of those genes necessarily.
Mm-hmm.
Make sense?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, it's pretty crazy. I could see hair color, eye color, that sort of stuff, height.
Yeah.
Like really striking some of the listeners, right? Like that's something that's still ingrained into our culture.
Yeah,
you like, would. It's it came from your grandma or it came from your pops or
right.
whatever it was.
and so those things, absolutely, you get the genes are going to influence like what is the likelihood that you're going to turn out to be really tall or really short. But even something like height, if you are really malnourished, or for whatever reason, put somewhere where your growth is very much restricted, that is going to affect how much those genes can actually be expressed. And the same is true for eye color. And even I've heard of instances where eye color is changed based on exposure to certain chemicals and other things like that, or damage to the eyes, I've heard can be. And so the people have gone from having brown eyes to even as drastically colored as like blue eyes, or at least one of them. Yeah. And so like these are things where the genes set it up that it could turn out this way and is likely to turn out this way, but the environmental circumstances could affect or restrict or facilitate how much those genes are really expressed. Yeah. And the last quote I want to read on here, this is from a guy who I think he actually is a journalist, maybe he's a psychologist. His name is I think David Shank. He wrote this book, and in it he said. He was actually quoting someone else, and I didn't find this resource specifically, but he was citing someone else who said, genes store information coding for the amino acids sequences of proteins. That is all. They do not code for parts of the nervous system, and they certainly do not code for particular behavior patterns. So, again, sort of bold and sort of saying pretty, I think, bluntly up front what we can understand about how we should interpret genes and their respect to behavior, at least, from these people's opinions and the sources that they're pulling from. Yeah. So let's go ahead and just using what we've discussed so far, what can we conclude about genes and behavior specifically?
So I think the first thing is they're extremely critical in the development of not only biology, but also what we do. Right. Actual behavior.
Yeah,
right?
Absolutely. And so I think and I sort of said this earlier, but the genes are going to provide the biological arrangement that you have, so whatever you're born with, that allows you to react to certain ways to your environmental processes.
So can we say that they kind of enable circumstances for behavior?
Yes, yeah? I love that.
Okay.
That's our next good soundbite.
Okay, cool.
They enable circumstances for behavior. That's well said.
Okay, great.
So, and it's really interesting and useful to understand how changes in these biological processes, specifically at the level of genes here, but there are other ones you could talk about. They alter the context for the whole organism, and therefore they alter the context, at least to some degree, for how you can, for behavior.
Yeah, 100%. Cool. I could maybe give an example real quick, I think, of one of those. Let's see how it goes.
Yeah, I love it.
So parrots, a lot of people, so a parrot will drink water through kind of curving its tongue and picking up from the bottom of its tongue. Mm-hmm. And a lot of people say it's a genetic sort of thing. Now, what it kind of is yes, genes play a role in the expression, right, and the shape of like how those beaks are formed. Right. Now, is it necessarily the genes per se, or is it the way in which the beak was actually formed that kind of forces that behavioral pattern? Does that make sense?
Absolutely.
Okay. Does that count?
Yeah. No, I totally think so. And I think another good example is we, as humans, our genes enable the retinas of our eyes to only capture certain wavelengths of light. Yeah. So if someone were to write something that reflected a wavelength of light that we simply can't see, then we will never interact with whatever it is that was written. Yeah. Because our genes they have not prepared us to be able to react to that event or to the circumstances. Right.
Good example that I mentioned of, I think it was in the self-management episode, was when I was working in the fish lab and working with goldfish. Right. We worked in an automated hoop that they'd swim through. We teach them to swim through it. And the automated hoop was counted through an infrared beam. They could actually see the infrared beam. Oh, whereas cool. We could not. So it was very interesting to teach people that sort of aspect through that medium. Yeah. So what it was is new students would come into the lab. They would be wondering why this fish isn't swimming through a hoop. Once you turned and plugged the hoop on, and it was, it pretty much looks like there's a wall there now. Right. Yeah. You had to teach them that they could go through that wall.
That's so cool.
Yeah.
Yeah. That's great. And I'm going to talk about this a little bit later, but thinking about in terms of people might say like, oh, I'm really good at art because I'm genetically, it's just my genes. And
Yeah.
and actually this happened recently because I really love to draw, and I'm decent at it. I'm no like artist or anything, but I like to draw, and I can usually put together a picture of kind of anything I want to.
Nice.
And so, but neither of my parents ever got into art or drawing or anything. And so my mom told me when she was looking at some of my drawings, she's like, I have no idea where you get this from. And I'm like, practice and a pencil and a piece of paper, and as far as genetics are concerned, I had to have hands that were capable of moving that pencil. I had to have eyes that were capable of visual stimulation for seeing what it was I was drawing. And I had to have a brain that was set up that it could interpret those patterns in some meaningful way so that I could both react to it as well as it could control my hand so that my hand could react to it. I am biologically set up to be able to draw. And the extent to which I'm good at drawing is because I have all of the faculties I needed to, and I had the opportunity to practice. Okay, so what can't genes do then? It's more of again, just this conclusion about what do genes do? What don't they do?
Yeah, well, they can't do anything by themselves.
Right.
Pretty plain and simple, right?
Yes.
Whether it's our perspective or the other experts that we kind of reference.
Right.
They just can't do it by themselves.
Yeah.
They're crucial, but they cannot do these things by themselves.
Yeah, and I think this gets and the other thing is that the environment can't do anything without the genes.
Perfect.
Yeah,
I'm glad that you brought that in.
Right. This goes back to that quote that Berger provided. It's that nothing that the environment's not interacting with us if there's no genetic organism, there's no behavior, there's no biology there to interact with, like it's doing nothing. And if there's no biology to receive that environment, then we're doing nothing. So
they're not the causal variable,
right?
Say they don't cause anything here, but they are part of these complex behavioral patterns that are going on. They
right.
played a role here. And
giving another example, so I give the one about how I've got the right equipment to be able to draw. Genes might determine where your ears are on your body and how sensitive they are and whether or not you have working neural connections to your ears. And all of that's going to be necessary for you to form some kind of preference in music. If you can't hear anything, you probably, and you never heard anything in your whole life, you probably are not going to enjoy music a whole lot. Maybe you do. I could be wrong. If you are listening to this podcast somehow with your earless head and you, then
I don't know how that'd work. I was trying to think of something, but I got nothing.
No, if you're listening, if somehow you're receiving this message and you don't have any cochlea or any ears or any auditory stimulation whatsoever, but you like music, I would really like to hear from you. But otherwise, like I guess
you're talking about it wouldn't count if it was like translated over into visual and like text, right?
Yeah, because then you're no longer. I'm not even talking about the fact that you might be able to visually decode something. It's that, like, do you enjoy listening with your ears to music? You have to have ears for that, right? But the genes are going to determine whether or not you have ears and to what extent they're sensitive to sounds and that sort of thing. But they're not going to tell you that you have to listen to Metallica.
Yeah.
Like, your genes aren't going to say, there's no Katy Perry gene that's like, you're born with this. By the time I'm 15, I'm going to be on YouTube looking up everything Katy Perry does. It's just in my genes, And I think that people approach some of these things like genes. They're just, because our biology is so based in genes, it's tempting to try and explain everything we do in terms of the genes alone. But it's never the genes alone. The genes set the stage.
Perfect.
And I just one more, just because, this really could go on, because this really is all human behavior. Genes are involved. And the circumstances that allow those genes to be expressed are involved. Mm-hmm. So you can't look at someone's genes and know necessarily how good they're going to be at driving unless they're also blind or have no motor control. Then you'll have a pretty good idea how good they'll be at driving. Not good. You could also look at genes and how, actually, I'm gonna take it back. There's probably some like technology that would allow someone who even doesn't have those basic connections to be good at driving. But anyway, you couldn't look at someone's genes and know necessarily how good they're going to be at instruments. They might be like set up so that they have really sensitive ears, or for whatever reason, they are really sensitive to really rapid changes in like noise. Maybe they'll be better at instruments if they have the opportunity to practice. But those factors alone does not mean that if you put a piano in front of them, they're just going to be the next Mozart.
Yeah, you're not going to know anything about their preferences at all, right?
Yeah. Genes are going to tell you like where you want to live in the world.
What you enjoy doing on your weekend.
Yeah,
right?
they're not going to determine your preferences for these things, not the food you like, not the music you listen to, not the house you choose, except that they are all related to the biological processes that are affected by those options.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so that's my major spiel on sort of how genes are involved in this process. And just to point out, like we did when we were talking about the brain, it's absolutely critically important. And genes are absolutely critical important, and they're a part of this whole interaction. It's just not the whole explanatory system to just say, well, if you're doing it, it's just got to be your genes. Well, yeah, of course, that my genes are there, but like there are other things that are really important in understanding this too.
Yeah, so we probably have some listeners hanging on the edge now saying, what about twin studies, right?
Yeah.
And we're not going to go there in this episode, right?
Yeah, no, actually, I'd planned to do a whole separate thing on twin studies and use that as a forum to sort of discuss how we can look at genes that way.
Mm-hmm.
And it's just way too big for what we really want to do in this particular episode.
Okay, but we were going to jump into another term, right? Epigenetics.
Yeah.
So we mentioned that earlier when we were talking about like where we're going to go.
Yeah. All right. So epigenetics. Let's start by defining it really quick. And I'm actually not going to give like the dictionary definition. I'm just going to discuss briefly what it means. And epigenetics really refers to the extent to which environmental factors affect gene expression and how that gene expression that has been changed can carry on to the next generation. Okay?
Yes.
Now, most of the time, alterations, those type of alterations don't necessarily last more than a single generation. There might be some evidence that they can carry on longer, but usually what will happen is something can affect gene expression, and then that particular change can be transferred over to the next generation, but then it'll be the normal gene expression unless something else changes thereafter.
Yeah. So I've got a couple examples of these.
Okay.
Is there anything on the like epigenetics we want to cover first for examples?
Well, I think so. I just mentioned this fact that like some things can change your genetic expression, and it's actually really important to know that your gene expression is really not static. Now, there are things that you can look at in your genes that are going to tell you certain things about like your ancestry and stuff, and that's really not going to change. But there are other gene expressions like how much does your thyroid work and all that sort of thing. I don't know why I use that as an example.
Yeah.
But anyway, gene expression is constantly changing throughout your life, and this can be seen in a lot of different things, even as you grow old and how that's going to change your bodily functions and that sort of thing. Those all sort of show up. And so although I mentioned that like there can be these events that change your genetic expression, there's actually it's happening constantly, like all the time. Even as you're sitting here listening to this, certain things are affecting how your genes are being expressed because there's a lot of them. Yeah,
I remember the first time I heard of epigenetics, it was in a class in my master's program, and it made me kind of step back and think of like maybe that's why certain people maybe smoke their whole life, but they don't. Like we have different, I guess, end results for those things, whether it's cancer or not,
Yeah.
Like, and it's not like I don't know the answer. I don't know if anyone knows the answer to those sort of things.
Mm-hmm.
But it was kind of this way to look at the world and be like, wow, it's way more complex than I thought. There's a lot of things that are always changing. Like it is literally just exponential and just like all over the place.
Right.
So it makes sense as to like why we don't have these answers.
Yeah.
So I guess I'll jump into a couple examples of like epigenetics that I was kind of pitched in my class. All right.
Okay.
So the first one was, and I'm going to link both of these in the show notes, like just more reading on them.
Okay.
Because I will not do them justice, but I'm just going to kind of do a high level overview. So the first was a rat study where they were trying to, I don't remember how they came about this, but it was vitamin B12.
Okay.
And when they altered vitamin B12, in the mother prior to her having a litter, the presence or absence of that could actually change two things. Whether or not the rats had a certain type of color of fur, as well as whether they would be more obese or not. And it was like there or not because of the alteration of this like mechanism of B12.
Okay.
It was very, very interesting to me.
Yeah.
And from there, the same thing like you were talking about, like they didn't see this progression. And the big question that I've always seen in epigenetic talk and literature is to what extent do these really carry on past that, one generation?
Mm-hmm.
And I've seen a lot of people that I guess I respect chime in and just say, be very careful in that, this one thing might only be this, might only happen on one generation,
right?
Not carry on.
Mm-hmm.
But one thing that I thought was really interesting is there were some folks that took this back to looking at World War II and some of the countries that experienced famine in those times. And essentially they tried tracing down some lineage, and this gets even messier on like there's no real way to kind of control for this. But they're looking at the extent to which these famines may have led to future generations, essentially their gene expression being a factor for them carrying more weight throughout their life as a result of their past relatives going through this famine. Does that make sense?
Yes.
Yes.
I was gonna make a joke about how several generations of my ancestors must have been famished.
Yeah. Again, they were just like, it was one of these like extrapolations of like where this could probably go. But there's no causal variables there. So it was an area, I guess, those are two examples of some of the, one was a controlled research, the other one was kind of this exploratory area of like where this could lead implication-wise. I thought they were very interesting, at the very least.
Yeah. So the 5maybe12 is that's pretty interesting. And that speaks to, I was going to mention some things like what other kind of events or exposures might affect how our genes change in this sort of epigenetic fashion. And so a list that I got from a book called The Science of Consequences by Susan Schneider, this is actually a totally partial list. This isn't everything that was in there. But mentioned, and she cited some research for this, that even visual stimulation can change gene expression, sounds, smells, chemicals, even like actions such as like exercise, or dietary preference, or other things. All of these things can actually influence how genes are expressed, and some of them are more easily influenced than others. But what can happen is that when that gene expression changes, that now changes the circumstances in which you're behaving, and so your behavior might shift as a function of that. But also, the environmental circumstance was the one that produced that change in the genetic expression in the first place, which you're now behaving differently in that environment, and so that new interaction that you have is going to be a little bit different again, and there's just going to be this constant back and forth effect that's going on.
Cool.
All right, so I guess we now need to dig in more to a little bit of the history of the epigenetic effects, and then I think we'll bring it back to sort of big picture, and then we will just sort of wrap it up there.
Wrap it up there?
Yeah, okay. Good?
Yeah, so this is a little bit of what should be a much bigger story that we'll tell some other time. But there was a researcher, Xingyang Guo, and he had a book, something titled around like epigenetic behaviorism. I thought it was very interesting because it was published, I believe, in 1967. And this epigenetic thing was kind of all the research that I was being referenced in my class was from the early 2000s. Sure. And that sort of, I know it's, at least in the classes and kind of the circles that I'm in, was getting a lot of talk about recent developments in these areas. Mm-hmm. So dove in a little bit more, and essentially he was born on the southern coast of China, and it was around 1918 when he came over to America after some unrest in China. Okay. And he started studying. He was really interested in this concept of instinct. Okay. So he looked at instinct, and he was kind of set out to just essentially kind of crush instinct being the variable as to why people do what they do.
That was a hot topic at that time.
Yeah, it was. And he walked that out a lot. I think instincts are something we could maybe take on a whole separate topic sometime. But he essentially bounced around a couple different times between China and the U.S., particularly around World War II, and some different things were going on socially. But he had an inheritance at one point, and then he essentially built a 3-story research lab. And Sweet. He spent 12 to 14 hours a day, 7 days a week, looking at these sort of epigenetic sort of things. And at the end of all this, after 20, 30 years of not only moving across countries, back when you're riding like on these wooden ships and stuff like that right. to get across, he got a lot of research done, and he came down to essentially a few certain things. So he had 5 groups of what he called determining factors. So I want to hit those real quick. Okay. First one was what he called morphological factors, and that morphological just is looking at the structure of how an organism or living thing is put together. Right. So a very simple way to think about these sort of things is you and I cannot fly. We don't have wings. If we step off the edge of a building, we are not going to sustain ourselves, right? True. Now, anything with feathers, the besides an ostrich, maybe, he like has a much better chance of those sort of things happening, right?
So there's just many examples of flightless bird.
Yeah. Okay. So that's one factor. So he was saying, so at the end of his research, he said morphological factors are things that need to be taken into account when we're looking at the behavior and why behavior occurs.
Right.
Next one was biophysical and biochemical factors. I am not an expert in those areas, but this is where a lot of the chemical and biological things we've talked about can be housed in his system.
So there might be like hormones and even neurotransmitter, like brain chemicals that are present, and like how maybe the muscles work, like what kind of chemicals make the muscles contract, and that will influence how quickly they can contract and that sort of thing.
Yeah, exactly. So yeah, perfectly summarized. Way to go, Abraham.
Thanks.
So his third factor was stimulating objects. These are just the things out in the environment that we interact with.
Mm-hmm.
He then talked about developmental history, which history essentially is everything that you've contacted up into that point, and it's just continually evolving, right?
And a good example of that actually might be preference for certain types of tastes, especially in animals. For anybody who's listening to this who might have a cat and notice that they are particular, and dogs do this too, they get really, really picky with the type of food that they are willing to eat. But interestingly, cats that are maybe feral are less likely to be picky. They'll just kind of eat whatever they can that comes in front of them because for them, their history, the developmental history, has been that the opportunity for a meal is like take it because the next one may not be forthcoming. And so a preference for flavor has not really been an option in that particular circumstance.
Yeah.
And nice. Other cultures, I think, do a similar thing where it's the food that's available in their region are the kind of things that they're going to eat.
Yeah.
And so the kind of flavors that they prefer are based on what's available to them and what's part of their culture.
Yeah, it makes sense, especially with the repeated tastings like literature, right?
Yeah.
You try things a few times and you got this development.
Wait, did you say like literature?
Sorry. Yeah, the repeated tastings. So like there's research looking at like basically takes 2-3 times of like tasting things to start to kind of develop.
I thought you meant like a book, like you're licking a book.
No.
I have this image of you just like, is this book any good? And you taste the spine of the book. Like I don't like it right now. I'm gonna come back in a week. And see
No.
Okay,
No.
I know what you're talking about then with the like the food dudes stuff.
Yeah.
That I'm familiar with.
Okay.
The word literature, I'm sorry.
Threw us off.
Sorry.
Yeah, so the fourth one he had was developmental history. The last one was developmental context, and context I think is just easiest to talk about as I kind of threw an example for this one, which I know isn't the best way to kind of talk about it, but I think it does it justice. So what it is it's not just, I guess, the stimulating objects and kind of the environment that's determining, or the object alone that determines what's going on. It's the context that it's occurring in. So what I'm getting at is under two different environmental contexts, we can actually have two very different behaviors shape up. So where I'm kind of going with this is that under two different environmental contexts, you have two very different behaviors.
Even for the same like animal or person.
Same person, yes.
Yeah.
So sometimes I've like come into contexts where you're working with a child and you're helping a child in a school setting. Mm-hmm. And you'll have parents say, I've never seen that sort of thing before at home, right?
Absolutely.
And what it is yes, and and it could be vice versa too. They've never seen it at the school as well. So they're seeing totally different things. And there's a few reasons why that sort of stuff can occur. But essentially what it comes down to is this context and the different variables, different people involved in each can essentially shape up different behavioral patterns, right?
Right, yeah, absolutely.
So those were his 5 different factors. Morphological factors, biophysical and biochemical factors is one itself, the stimulating objects, developmental history, and developmental context. And I just mentioned that as a framework to kind of think about like the different things that, so we're always saying like it's not one thing, it's all these things. So that was one framework that you can kind of think about these 5 different factors when you're trying to think about why it is that we do what we do. Mm-hmm. And one example, though, of like, I guess what kind of came about this and what he was interested in looking at was he really jumped into for, I think, somewhere around 20 years, studying the behavioral patterns and the development of chicks, little baby chicks. Mm-hmm. So from embryo stages all the way up until past when they were hatching. And he kind of figured out these 12 stages and used stages as just a way to communicate it. It's not like you're moving from one to the next, but he needed kind of clear ways in which you could say, you're at one stage and you're going to the next stage.
Sort of like saying like a benchmark of, describing how things progress and arbitrarily deciding at this point this seems like a significant enough change that I'm going to call this a next stage, right?
Yes, exactly. And he developed a cool. So part of it was he spent years figuring out how to kind of look at the inside of eggs without disrupting them. So I saw this about 2 years ago pop up as it was discovered, quote unquote, that you could that researchers have found a way to essentially kind of alter the shell to where the chick could still develop, but you could see within it. And he actually figured that out some 60 years before this other research. It's a good example of how things kind of get lost in our science, and we rediscover things. So an example of like why this is relevant is he now had a way to study. He could kind of figure out these different stages that we talked about. And I want to give an example of those. And that was that there was kind of like he found that there was 4 conditions that were necessary for an egg to hatch. And that was that respiration needed to be occurring. The position of the remaining yolk sac actually was a factor in where it was actually positioned within the egg.
Sure.
The shell had to be dry, and then there had to be a certain amount of circulation occurring or seized, depending on like what you're looking at within the egg, for hatching to actually occur. So I was going to try to bring this back as into like what was Guo interested in, like why are we kind of talking about this.
Mm-hmm.
He was very interested in like how these different areas of biology, chemistry, environmental context, influence, etc., came into one. And his framework was really that it was a lot more complex. It's not just this one thing. His one thing was instincts. It wasn't genetics like we're kind of talking about today.
Mm-hmm.
What he said is if you look at all these factors, then you have a lot better of a framework to kind of approach the world and look at things through.
Okay.
Yeah, so real quick, you were talking about phenotypes earlier, right?
Genotypes, but phenotypes are important too.
Can you hit both of those again real quick?
Genotype refers to the total genetic makeup of a person, and the phenotype is the set of characteristics that you will see in a particular individual that are caused by the interaction between the genotype and the environment. So it's the genotype is just the total genetic makeup, and the phenotype is observable characteristics.
Okay, yeah. So to tie this into Guo and like what he was really interested in is he was thinking that someday what we could do is we could understand all these different factors as to why we do what we do, and what it would lead to is these kind of new behavioral, he called them neo-phenotypes.
Okay.
So what it is the epigenetic behaviorist, quote unquote,
Mm-hmm.
which is his thing, or I kind of look at it as like psychology could maybe look at in the ways in which all these things happen,
Mm-hmm.
and maybe provide a framework on how to shape up behavior or influence behavior that can kind of counteract what's going on in our environment. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
So it's not just like for kind of a crazy example, like it's not just like we need to focus on hitting environmental influences. So let's take an example like climate change. We could look at it through the environmental factors and saying we need to reduce certain things. But his thing was like maybe we can look at the way in which behaviors are shaped from throughout the lifetime, because a lot of those can be maybe restricted over time, or maybe not, quote unquote, like expressed. To kind of use that metaphor.
Right.
And what we could do is, as a society, look at how do we actually shape up behavioral patterns that could help counteract those environmental things, and help actually counter something like climate change.
Okay.
Make sense?
Yeah, totally.
Okay, cool.
All right. So the big picture, I think here, all that we've been discussing with respect to genes is that you can change behavior and circumstances, and that is going to affect how that genetic expression of the organism, the person or the animal, reacts to those circumstances, because their biology of that organism is now differently prepared to interact and react to those circumstances based on that change in that interaction. Okay, so that's sort of the big picture. Is just that the gene, again, I like to say in class, the genes set the stage, the environment seals the deal. And yeah, so you get, you're capable of certain things because your genes enable those interactions to occur. The nature of those interactions are going to influence how those genes occur. And they're just part of the whole behavioral process. So, and I remember saying, when I said earlier, it was pointless to try and separate those two. And at the level of just understanding, looking at behavior as that whole interaction and that back and forth process, I stand by that it's not particularly useful to say that there's just one and just the other. However, you might look at how you want to intervene on those things. And that's where I was planning to close this out, is just there's this thing called gene therapy. And there's basically three parts of gene therapy. And there's replacing defective genes or genes that are being expressed in such a way that they're harmful. There's knocking out, is what they call it, which is basically destroying mutated or improperly functioning genes that lead to, again, problems. And then the other part of this is introducing a new genetic sequence that can either replace or supplant or superimpose on top of these. And so that new genetic sequence. And what that's going to do is that alters that whole biological circumstance, which then makes it so that you interact differently with those circumstances. And now I think it's important to look at if this is really useful when you have a problem that's caused at the level of gene mutations and genetic problems. Mm-hmm. Like that's a really good place that you want to use this. It's just important to note, like that is a pretty invasive procedure. And if you have a behavior that's been shaped up primarily by the environmental circumstances that simply capitalized on the availability of that genetic circumstance for that person, then it's a lot less invasive and a lot easier to just simply go in and change those circumstances in their environment instead. And so it could be a two-pronged approach. You could do both. You could alter the genes and alter the environment. You could go that way. You could just alter the genes, and hopefully that will prepare that organism to interact with that environment that they're in differently. And or you could change the environment. And I think for me, a metaphor or maybe an analogy for how this might look is it's sort of like, let's say you live in a house that is filling up with poison gas. The genetic approach is just put on a gas mask because now you've changed the way that you interact with the environment that you're in. Yeah. The environmental approach is open some windows and get the gas out of there, and then you don't have to change how the genes are set up. Or you could do both. You could air out the entire house and still wear a gas mask. That's probably the best option. If it ever fills up with poison again, you're well prepared to deal with it. And maybe that's not a very fair analogy. It's probably missing some crucial details. But just this whole idea that it really depends on what sort of level the problem is. Yeah. Like if you live in a world that's full of poisonous gas, well, you don't just get to open a window and get rid of it. You're gonna need that gas mask. Yeah. You need to walk around. And so for some people, that's kind of how their world is. Like every environment seems toxic to their genetic makeup. So the gene therapy is the best way to go because that's going to be the most comprehensive way of dealing with all the environments they're going to be in. But for certain people, as you pointed out earlier, those environmental circumstances are just different from place to place, and their behavior changes in accordance with those environments. And so we can see that they're genetically fine in one environment, but they behave very differently in another one. And so then we look at, okay, the simplest change here is open the windows, get the poison gas out. We're going to change this environment over here. And because we know that other environments are more facilitating to this kind of behavior that is more useful and more productive. That's a lot of stuff.
Great. Yeah, that's a lot.
All right. Do you have anything else you want to cover on this?
I think that's good.
Cool, man.
We'll see how the comment sections do.
Yeah, exactly.
It's a scary area. There's a lot that goes into this. Yeah,
so we'd love to hear from you. Please send us your feedback. If you are enjoying the podcast so far, you'd like to help us out, you don't necessarily need to give us any money. You can if you want to. But simply clicking that subscribe button helps it out. That shows us in the ratings about how we're doing, how people are liking the podcast. Leaving a review is super helpful. So in iTunes or Google Play or Podcast Addict,
Stitcher, whatever it is that you're in,
exactly. Wherever you can leave a review, that really helps out the algorithm and helps out the show. And so thanks for listening. I think we're out.
That's it. Yep. Abraham and RYANO out.
Signing off.
You've been listening to Why We Do What We Do. Why We Do What We Do is supported in part by ABAI's Disseminating Behavior Analysis Special Interest Group and our amazing listeners. If you like what you heard, consider heading to our Patreon account at patreon.com/WWDWWD podcast. Anything helps, and we are continuously lining up perks and merch for our supporters. If you have any comments or questions, we'd love to hear from you. Find us at WWDWWD podcast on your favorite social media platforms. You can learn more about this and other episodes by going to www.wwdpodcast.com. There, you'll find links as well as detailed and shareable show notes. Why We Do What We Do is Abraham, RYANO, and Miranda. Artwork and logo design by Andrew Pollock at nogdesigns.com. Video and production assistance from Tyler Bessire with music courtesy of Justin Greenhouse. Brendan Bohr does our episode art. Thanks for listening, and we hope you have an awesome day.